In June 2025, the United Nations Security Council became the stage for Russia's most direct and forceful warnings yet, as the world watched with bated breath. The chamber, already tense from months of escalating global crises, now found itself at the epicenter of a new diplomatic storm. This time, Russia's message was aimed squarely at the United States and Israel, two nations whose recent military actions had drawn international scrutiny and concern. Moscow accused both countries of pushing the world toward a dangerous tipping point, warning that their escalating military operations against Iran risked igniting a much broader conflict in the already volatile Middle East. Russian officials from the highest levels of government to their seasoned diplomats condemned what they described as unprovoked aggression. They warned that such actions could trigger radical destabilization, not just in the region, but across the globe. The warnings were delivered through fiery speeches on the UN floor and a series of official statements, each more urgent than the last. Russia signaled, in no uncertain terms, that it would not stand by as the specter of war loomed ever larger. Russian envoy Vasily Nebenzia, speaking with grave intensity, drew a chilling parallel to the 2003 Iraq invasion. He accused the United States of repeating the same mistakes, acting unilaterally, based on perceived threats, and disregarding the lessons of history. The message was unmistakable. Unilateral military action, justified by vague or disputed intelligence, risked plunging the world into chaos. Nebenzia warned that the consequences of such recklessness could be catastrophic, not just for the Middle East, but for the entire international order. Russia made it clear it would oppose any moves that threatened to destabilize the region further, vowing to use its influence and veto power to block what it saw as dangerous adventurism. With the world still reeling from the devastation of the Ukraine war and a rapidly shifting global order, Russia saw both danger and opportunity. It sought to cast itself as a voice of reason, standing against what it called reckless American and Israeli actions and appealing to nations wary of further conflict. The stakes were unmistakably high. A wider conflict could spiral out of control, drawing in more nations and threatening global stability in ways not seen for decades. In this critical moment, Russia was determined to be heard, positioning itself as a counterweight to Western power and a defender of international law, even as the world braced for what might come next. The crisis erupted in a flash of violence after Israel launched a series of surprise airstrikes deep inside Iranian territory, targeting not only nuclear facilities, but also high-ranking military leaders. The world was stunned by the boldness and precision of the attacks, which sent shockwaves through the region and beyond. For many, it marked a dangerous new phase in a long-simmering conflict. Tehran's response was immediate and fierce. Missiles and drones rained down on central Israel, striking both military and civilian targets. The skies above Tel Aviv and Jerusalem lit up with the fire of incoming projectiles as air raid sirens wailed and residents scrambled for shelter. The sense of vulnerability was palpable, and the fear of further escalation gripped the nation. But Iran's retaliation didn't stop at Israel. A major U.S. base in Qatar was also struck, sending a clear message that Tehran viewed Washington as a direct participant in the conflict. The attack left significant damage and casualties, raising the stakes for the entire region. For years, Israel and Iran had fought in the shadows, through cyber attacks, sabotage, and covert operations. Now the conflict had burst into the open, threatening to engulf not just the two nations but the entire Middle East in open warfare. The United States, long a key player in the region, was pulled directly into the fray. Iran made it clear that it saw Washington as complicit in Israel's actions, and American forces across the Middle East were put on high alert. The Pentagon scrambled to assess the rapidly evolving situation. Each strike triggered a harsher response, creating a volatile feedback loop with little room for de-escalation. The tit-for-tat attacks grew in intensity, with both sides vowing not to back down. Civilians and soldiers alike braced for what could come next. Israel framed its actions as preemptive self-defense against the threat of a nuclear-armed Iran, insisting it had no choice but to act. Iran, meanwhile, called the strikes acts of war, demanding powerful retaliation and rallying its people for a fight they claimed was forced upon them. The world watched in alarm, fearing that a regional war could quickly spiral out of control and draw in global superpowers. Diplomats rushed to convene emergency meetings, while ordinary people everywhere anxiously followed the news, hoping for a breakthrough that might halt the violence. The logic of escalation left both sides and their allies locked on a path toward catastrophe. With every new attack, the risk of a wider war grew, and the possibility of peace seemed to slip further away. The Middle East teetered on the edge, with every new attack raising the stakes and deepening the sense of crisis. Cities braced for more strikes and families huddled in fear, uncertain of what tomorrow would bring. The deadly cycle showed no signs of slowing, as leaders on all sides struggled to find a way out of the spiral of violence that threatened to consume the region. Russia sounded the alarm on a new front, the risk of nuclear disaster. Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova warned that Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear sites brought the world millimeters from catastrophe, likening the threat to Fukushima. The IAEA confirmed damage at Iranian sites, validating Russia's fears of radioactive fallout. Zakharova criticized the global silence on the environmental risks, highlighting the potential for a dirty bomb scenario or meltdown. The fallout would cross borders, poisoning land and water, with consequences far beyond the battlefield. By focusing on nuclear safety, Russia reframed the crisis as a global environmental threat, not just a regional conflict. Russia's condemnation came from the very top. President Putin called the attacks on Iran unjustified aggression, warning the conflict now threatened global security. Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov cautioned the U.S. against direct intervention, drawing a red line. Intelligence Chief Naryshkin called the situation critical, underscoring the Kremlin's alarm. At the UN, Ambassador Nebenzia compared U.S. actions to the lead-up to the Iraq War, warning of history repeating itself. Russia's leadership presented a united front challenging American and Israeli narratives. The message: the era of uncontested U.S. military dominance in the Middle East was over. Any future actions would face determined Russian opposition. The world was on notice. Russia would not be sidelined. In contrast, Washington and Tel Aviv doubled down on threats. President Trump issued public taunts and threats against Iran, even hinting at targeting Supreme Leader Khamenei. U.S. and Israeli officials openly discussed regime change, closing the door on negotiations. Israel insisted its strikes were self-defense, vowing to act unilaterally if needed. The rhetoric from both capitals created a dangerous echo chamber, escalating tensions and leaving Iran feeling cornered. The war of words was quickly becoming a war of worlds. Iran's leadership responded with defiance. Khamenei warned the U.S. of irreversible repercussions for any attack. Publicly, Tehran promised symmetrical retaliation. Privately, it sought urgent support from Moscow. Foreign Minister Araghchi delivered a personal plea to President Putin, requesting advanced air defenses, intelligence, and a security guarantee. Iran knew its own capabilities were no match for U.S. and Israeli power. Russian backing was seen as essential for survival. The mission to Moscow revealed the limits of Iran's self-reliance and the high stakes of its alliances. Tehran's fate now depended on how far Russia was willing to go. The region's future hung in the balance. Iran's hopes for security and regional influence rested heavily on a new 20-year strategic pact with Russia, signed just months before the crisis erupted. The agreement was hailed in Tehran as a turning point, a symbol of a powerful alliance that could counterbalance Western pressure and isolation. Iranian leaders spoke of an unbreakable partnership, believing that Moscow's support would deter their adversaries and provide a much-needed safety net. The agreement promised deep cooperation in areas like trade, energy, and military technology, but crucially, it lacked a mutual defense clause. There was no guarantee that Russia would come to Iran's aid if conflict broke out. Russia wanted to support Iran, but it was careful not to be dragged into a direct war with the US or Israel. Moscow's leaders understood the risks of escalation and were determined to avoid a confrontation that could spiral out of control. Moscow's support was strategic and conditional, not a blank check. The Kremlin weighed every move, balancing its interests in the Middle East with its broader global ambitions. The fall of Assad in Syria made Iran even more vital to Russia's regional strategy, but at the same time, the Kremlin was quietly seeking a thaw with Washington, hoping to ease tensions and avoid new sanctions. Russian officials kept the US-Iran crisis separate from their own talks with the US, carefully avoiding any direct confrontation that could jeopardize their diplomatic efforts or economic interests. Tehran grew increasingly frustrated by the lack of concrete military aid. No S-400 missile systems, no direct intervention, just strong words and vague promises of support. The so-called unbreakable partnership, it turned out, had clear and very real limits. When push came to shove, Russia's priorities lay elsewhere. In the end, Iran was left to face its adversaries with little more than diplomatic backing, realizing that even its closest allies would not risk everything on its behalf. As the initial strikes faded, the Middle East settled into a tense, unstable equilibrium. Russia, China, and Pakistan called for an immediate ceasefire at the UN, seeking to position themselves as peacemakers. The US and Israel dismissed these efforts as attempts to shield Iran, deepening the divide. Putin's offer to mediate was rejected, highlighting the deep mistrust between blocs. The world was split, one side demanding restraint, the other insisting on preemptive action. Any ceasefire was fragile, liable to collapse with the next provocation. A full-scale war would devastate the region, disrupt global oil, and create a refugee crisis. The risk of a nuclear disaster loomed, threatening consequences far beyond the Middle East. The world held its breath, hoping for restraint, but fearing the next spark was inevitable.